to introduce Tim Wu. Nice to meet you. And I'm going to read all the things that he's done.
Dear.
He's a Isidore and Seville Solzbacher Professor of Law at Columbia. He's a former chair of Media Reform Group for Free Press. He's a contributor to The New Yorker. And he coined the term net neutrality and is the foremost expert on the issue. But before I let him speak, as some of you know, I was a former school teacher. So I want to let Tim know about the audience that he's addressing. So, how many of you know nothing about net neutrality except maybe what the word neutral means? That's pretty good. That's pretty good. How many of you have a fairly good idea of the basics of net neutrality?
Good thing.
Okay, and then the final question is, how many of you know the ins and outs of net neutrality and can discuss them later over a beer with Tim?
I'm with the beer.
I'll be alone with him having the beer.
Then you better educate everybody.
Sure. Yeah, great.
Okay. Jim.
Well, Tim, thank you so much for it is an honor and pleasure to be here at this distinguished club. I'm very happy to be invited and took the invitation right away. I want to thank you also. Some of you may know I ran for Lieutenant Governor this summer with Zephyr Teachout. And with your support, I want to say we won the village, I think 78% or something in the village with your support. And I really appreciate that. I won Manhattan and 26 other counties and ended up with 40% of the vote. So, I would have liked to have won. But I was incredibly grateful to the groups that went, obviously took a certain risk. Going against, not exactly speaking out, but having the courage to endorse, someone else than the incumbent candidate is something I really respect. And I have an undying respect and undying gratitude for all the groups that, in some sense, went on a limb to support our candidacy. And I think we sent a message, and I was really, it was one of the best evenings of the campaign. I think I stood over there and tried to, it was in a debate with Kathy Hochul's representative. And I thank you also for endorsing me that night. And now we'll talk about net neutrality. Politics is over. So I think for those of us who consider ourselves progressive Democrats, there are a few issues that are really burning right now. And one, obviously, is police brutality, police killings, and whether our criminal justice system is really up to where we should be as a nation. Another issue that has kind of unexpectedly come out of nowhere this year, it seems like nowhere, is net neutrality. And I want to explain tonight where I think the issue came from, what deeper tensions it's tapping into. Because it is not just because, there are some people who care about net neutrality because they're, internet natives and care deeply about it. I'm one of them. But it has tapped into much deeper currents, much deeper tensions in our society today, and I want to tell you some of what those are. And I want to describe where I think the issue is going and then take questions. So I'm going to spend probably about 15 or 20 minutes on this topic, and bear with me. So I'm going to go first of all back in history a little bit, because the origins of net neutrality are actually very deep. The United States is a country that has entrusted much of its basic infrastructure build-outs, whether that is the water system, well, the water system exception, whether that is the railroad lines traditionally, whether that is certain bridges, other things, and particularly the communications and transport system to private enterprise, to private companies. Other countries have always felt this needs to be done by government, done publicly. The American and actually English system has been to do this. And that has always led to a certain tension, because when you think about things like drinking water or roads, or communications, or transportation, or frankly banking or energy, or all these fields, they are areas where it's different than a normal business. There is more at stake in some of these essential industries than there is in the place where you buy your shoes. You know, if you don't have drinking water, or you can't get from place to place, or there's no hotel where you can stay, the economy can't function well, people's basic standard of living is affected. And so we have always had an issue of the public interest in certain essential infrastructure businesses. And I named some of them. And the traditional word for this is common carriage or utility industries. For much of the history of this country, communications has been handled by a few very large companies like the Bell System who have been in a partnership or a relationship with government. And the basic deal looked like this since about 1916, which is to say, on the one hand, this was the deal, AT&T, the Bell Company, this will get back net neutrality, you'll see. You get a monopoly. In exchange, we want you to do a number of things for the public. Some of the things that the Bell System agreed to do traditionally were to wire every home universal service. Another thing, this is very closely tied to net neutrality, is they agreed to be non-discriminatory in carrying messages. They didn't listen, sometimes they listen, but they didn't examine. Sometimes they listen, but they didn't. They were forced to serve everybody. This is the basic idea, and carry whatever people wanted to say. They were common carriers, and they were required to offer just and reasonable rates, not to use their monopoly position to overcharge. So this was the basic public-private deal that exists in the United States from about 1912 until the 1980s. In the 1980s, that deal was changed. We began an era of competition, a lot of hope, a sense that maybe competition would provide, in some ways, better services, lower prices, and so forth. In the last couple decades, we have come to a system where we have some of the old features of the old system, big monopolies, centralized power, but none of the public restraints, none of the public duties. Net neutrality is one of the classic restrictions placed on giant communications monopolists. That is, you shall carry everything, carry all traffic without discrimination. And so when you get to the origins of where did net neutrality come from, it comes from this basic tension between the big phone companies and the big cable companies who came a bit later, and the public. The first net neutrality rules, depending on how you date them, probably can be dated to the 1970s, where the Federal Communications Commission, the Justice Department, was worried that AT&T and the phone system would kill what was the very early internet because they didn't like it. They thought it might compete with them in ways they didn't like, and so forth. And so there was measures taken as early as the 60s and 70s to protect this new invention, this government project. Very important to remember the internet was built on government funding. It was originally a giant public works project funded entirely by government. Oh, sorry. Commercial interruption here. And so the earliest versions of net neutrality said, listen, there's this thing called the internet. When you carry it, just don't mess with things. Bring things from point A to point B. And that's all we want you to do. And that rule, some version of that rule, whether formal, informal, or some other thing, was in place until January of this very year, where it was struck down by a court of appeals in Washington, D.C., the latest version of this rule. And that is the vacuum in which the current uprising in support of net neutrality has occurred. Even to me, the amount of attention net neutrality has been a little bit surprising. I mean, I care about it because I've spent a lot of my career on it. But I was shocked and amazed at the outpouring of outrage from young people, from old people, from everyone, at the prospect that we might start to see on the internet slow lanes and fast lanes. That we might start to see some newspapers, the ones with, or some speakers, those with money, going faster, reaching people faster. Others, normal bloggers, speakers, regardless of political affiliation, just based on whether you could pay or not. Indicating again the divide more in this country is not between left or right, but between rich and poor, have and have not. And the idea of this dividing was so, I think, offensive to people that 4 million people wrote into the Federal Communications Commission. 4 million, which is maybe a world record for responses. You have to give John Oliver and some of the late night comedians some credit because they encourage people to do this. But we have a bona fide movement on our hands. And now I want to say, and the most recent and most important, not the most important, but one of the most important steps is Barack Obama has finally, maybe having lost the Senate, is like, all right, listen, I got to do some stuff before I get out of here. Gave a very important speech, result of a lot of behind-the-scenes pressure, but a very important speech where he said, that's it, we just need to stand for the strongest versions of net neutrality. I'm very proud of what the president did in November, and that's where we stand. The matters before the FCC to come up with a strong net neutrality rule. Now, and a rule that all it says, it's actually incredibly simple. It's just that same thing we've always said to the phone companies. In fact, it's relatively light. Just when people subscribe to the internet, they get to decide what they want to, what sites they want to go to. You, the phone or cable company, don't decide. You don't speed some people up or slow people down because they pay you or you agree with them politically or something. Just stay out of it. That's all it is. It's a non-discrimination rule. Treat all sites equally. It actually doesn't go as far as it could. It could introduce rate regulation. I'm probably not the only one who thinks that cable rate prices and telephone rate prices have gotten out of control. It doesn't actually mandate build-outs, which maybe it should do as all. So this is just the tip of the iceberg, actually. I mean, net neutrality, it's crazy that it's even controversial because it is mild compared to what people did in the progressive era, compared to what we even have in the 1970s. It is mild still, and still we find the Republican Party and the Tea Party are treating it like it's a form of communism or something. So we're talking about a relatively straightforward regulation that I'm glad. Now let me say what this is tapping into. Why is net neutrality being tapped into become a movement? Let me talk about 4 reasons. First of all, I think if you look around this country and you ask what are the basic things, the basic matters that are a concern today, I think regardless of who you are or even where you stand in the socioeconomic class, the issue of inequality has become intolerable. Intolerable to those of us who consider us devoted to a republic that wants to explore or is founded on the idea of equality. And I think the very premise that the public infrastructure of the internet, built by the government, and this basic network, which everyone unless some people ignore it, but let's say most of us have come to rely on day to day, the idea that that could be divided between rich lanes and poor lanes, slow lanes and fast lanes based on ability to pay. To me, it's as if you take the base, you have a fast lane and slow lane on the sidewalk or something. People have a craving for at least some of public space to remain equal to all of us. I mean, take something like Central Park. We have not, at least yet, got to the point where there's like a special door to get into Central Park if you're rich, and another door if you're poor. The subway, there's just one subway. Now, some people don't take the subway, but there's still just one subway. And I think it's very important that there remain, and I think it taps into the sense that people think this has gone too far. Number 2, I think there's a generation of people who have grown up on the internet as a symbol of freedom. One of my beliefs of this country has always had a frontier of one kind or another. That's not really my theory. It is kind of the theory of America. People came here in the first place because they thought America was a place they could be free. Later on, it was the Midwest. Believe it or not, the Midwest is where you would go. Later on, it became the West, and later on, the far West and so forth. And then once geographically the frontier disappeared, it became a technological frontier. If you wanted to have a different kind of life, you wanted to work in a different kind of industry, you would work in the new industry, whether it was the industry of cars or television industry or radio, and all of these things where the frontier was. In the last 10, 20 years or so, the frontier has been the internet. That's where people go who have a strange idea and want to start a company. That's where people who always wondered whether they could make it as a writer, try a blog, succeed or fail, at least you get your chance. It's where I think people sense a feeling of frontier, of freedom, of opportunity, and the idea that it could become closed down, the idea that it could become just like everything else, become like cable television, sort of predictably lousy. See, the internet is sometimes great and sometimes terrible. I mean, a lot of it is terrible. I'm not going to defend everything on the internet, but at least it is free, and at least it is a place that people feel they can front. So I think part of it is the reaction to that fear that the frontier will be closed down. The third thing that I think is being tapped into, linked somewhat to inequality, is also a growing suspicion about concentrated private power. We have lived through an era, and I'm an antitrust professor among other things, where the traditional controls on private power have all but disappeared. I had said to you earlier that we have some of the industrial structure of the early 20th century, but we no longer have the public-private trade-off. I mean, the old monopolists were monopolists, were sometimes abusive, but they had this sense of public duty. Today, companies like Comcast, companies like Verizon, AT&T, they have all the power and no sense of any duty other than to improve their quarterly earnings. No sense that they should owe anything at all to the public. And this is an intolerable situation. I think that the net neutrality issue is exacerbated by, for example, Comcast's effort to take over Time Warner Cable, which I'm involved in. In fact, I testified today at the public advocate's position. And a sense that, how did we let this happen, to have this internet, again, a government project, be hijacked by a few incredibly concentrated phone and cable companies who ultimately make a huge amount of money off of us, contribute nothing in particular other than the pipe, and stand in a position where they are the gatekeepers of what we see or hear. That, I think, strikes many people as intolerable. So these are the underlying issues, I think, that are really driving the net neutrality debate. And, it ignites, doesn't ignite I think there's a broader base of people who touched by what's happening in Ferguson or with some of these grand juries here in our own city. But for people who have a feeling for net neutrality, it ignites a political passion, ignites people to write or speak out or do something. And I think it reflects these economic justice issues, which have moved from becoming secondary, backwater issues, becoming front and center as one of the challenges of our time. So that's why I think net neutrality is such a big issue. Let me add, finally, where it's going. Right now, the president has, in some ways, has told his chairman of the FCC what he wants him to do. Chairman of the FCC is an independent official, and right now there's a lot of pressure on the chairman, both to block the Comcast merger and to come up with strong net neutrality rules based on the strongest possible legal jurisdiction that will last for a long time and not represent another cop-out to cable and telephone industry. So thank you very much for having me as speaker, and I am very honored to be here, and I'm looking forward to your questions. Thank you. Should what does club protocol entail? Do you want to call on these speakers? Or?
Why don't you?
Okay, sure. Thank you, sir.
I'd like to say that having the telephone companies and the cable TV companies basically control internet access is the same. It's almost the same as if buggy whip manufacturers controlled airlines, railroads, and car manufacturers and that type of thing.
Right.
And my question is, I believe that that's a good part of the problem. How can we change things so that community groups, local governments, small businesses that are really innovative can get involved in providing better internet access?
Well, that's a great question, a challenging question. So it used to be that being an internet service provider was a mom and pop kind of small business. In the 1990s, a lot of businesses, they are all bankrupt. They were all wiped out by cable and phone companies, and it is really, really hard to challenge them in business right now. I'm just going to be honest about it. Google is trying to challenge them, and Google's not doing very well. And they have $20 billion in the bank. They have set up a situation where they have a very powerful natural monopoly that's hard to compete with. I encourage, when people say, what can I do to encourage, to compete with these guys? Part of me wants to encourage anyone who wants to do something, but part of me is somewhat frightened when I see all the, I know a graveyard of companies that have tried to go against these guys and haven't written a history of this era. They are experts at killing the companies that try to compete with them. The only thing you could do it is you need to have a government rule that says these lines are shared lines. And that is some...
That was a trick question.
Yeah, because actually the way you need it is you have to structurally separate it. And that is a big project. Yeah. Sure.
I'm a longtime fighter and et cetera. And one of the things that I think is wrong with our current publicly controlled systems is that there's no oversight.
Right.
For example, when Federal Energy Regulation Commission rubber stamps things that are proposed by the big oil and gas companies and so on, it's the same thing in communications. I've been in touch lately with the Public Service Commission.
Yes, good. Thank you.
Yeah.
I know. I'm with, yeah.
What can we do? And the president saying that he's for net neutrality doesn't do it as long as there's no oversight of the FCC and so on. And the only way to fight him is to go to court, which is ludicrous.
Do you know who has oversight of the FCC? This is the challenge. Congress. Congress is saying as soon as you pass a net neutrality rule, we're going to pass a bill reversing it. Right. Congress's oversight is moving them in the exact opposite direction. There were a time where there were some Republicans, this is progressive, like Teddy Roosevelt era, who are on the other side of this issue, and it is the opposite. The Republicans, their overseers are pushing them in the opposite direction. You mentioned the airline industry. I'm not too happy about the airline industry either. It's another industry I think is really getting away with way too much. Well, there's a lot of questions, so I'll...
I was wondering whether you're familiar with Naomi Klein's new book.
Uh-huh. I haven't read her new book. I know her.
May I hand this
Thank you.
to
Oh, great.
She is talking about areas in the world where things have changed by communities getting together and enforcing industry, enforcing government to take back what the industry is doing.
Right.
It's interesting.
Look, I think the way this Constitution was written of the United States, they created a separation of powers and tried to balance powers against each other. The problem was that the founders never imagined how powerful the private sector would become. And so there's no constitutional check on private power, and it is like the greatest threat to this country, I've always thought. And I think the most serious problems facing America today have to do with this imbalance, where the public sector has gotten too weak. The people are supposed to control abuses of private power. I mean, this is sort of obvious after the recession, and I mean, this industry over here is the most obvious example. But I think you go across the industries, you just like, the airline industry. How are they getting away with this? Why are they letting these companies merge when the result is bad for consumers? I want to take on every industry, but there's so many areas, and I think one area where you see this. One of the things I'm really concerned about, I'm concerned about the middle class, but I'm also concerned in particular of how we've let these industries that provide the essentials, like I said, the basic services, whether it's energy, whether it's transportation, whether it's internet, you can't, whether it's actually banking, you can't decide, oh, I'm never going to, I mean, you can, but it's hard to say, I'm never going to get a plane again. I'm not going to drink water ever again. I'm not going to use electricity ever. I mean, it's hard. And these industries, have made, even though wages remain flat, the amount we pay for all these things just goes up and up and up. And so therefore, in real terms, everyone's getting poorer. And it's because of a lack of control over these industries. At some point, I know I'll take more of your questions, but net neutrality in some ways is dealing with the discrimination problem, and I think it's valid, and I'm glad there's a movement. Some point, this goes back to your question, if we don't have competition, if there are just monopolies, even the most diehard right-wing economists would say a monopoly that is completely unregulated is bad for consumers, and at some point you have to control their prices. And I think that's where we may have to go. Cable, I'm sorry to go on about this, but cable broadband costs less than $5 a month to provide. Who here is paying $5 for it? I've seen their books. It costs about, per customer, about less than $5. They charge, usually between $60 to $80. They kind of limit. They don't even let it go full speed. It is a gold mine. It is a gold mine. The margins in that industry are 97, 99, and they keep raising the prices anyway because they get away with it. Because where's the competition? At best, there's two companies competing. So one guy raises 70, the other guy's 80. Now, they just kind of go back and forth. And there's no oversight whatsoever of this. I mean, people look at it and be like, oh, I guess the way the market works. All right, question in the back.
Okay, two things. One, my understanding that as a common carrier, they enjoy immunity from the content that they carry.
Yeah, that's right.
And has anyone ever discussed removing that from them if they're not going to behave as a common carrier? And the second point, real quick, and you can discuss both, is back in the day when you had Rockefeller and Carnegie and stuff, those are individuals. Now you have Buffett and Gates talking about giving away most of their money. Mm-hmm. Aren't they the real power? Who have a face, who have a humanity, rather than the corporations that you mentioned? Yeah, that's
a deep question. Let me talk about the first question. I think there is, and there is someone who said that, namely, which is, in particular, the telecom companies, the internet carriers, enjoy a blanket immunity to copyright infringement based on the idea they're just moving stuff from A to B. And I've said to them, if you start choosing and picking who you want and getting involved in sort of curating stuff, I think you're going to lose that immunity. So there is some risk for them. They don't agree. They won't amend the law. So I think that is true. On the other question, a deep sort of philosophical question, but I am concerned. Sometimes I feel, I know people who work at these companies, and sometimes I feel like they're imprisoned as well. Like they sometimes want to do something better, but they have this pressure to have, increased profit. We have to increase the amount we get out of everyone. I mean, well, they know their product's not that great, and they know they charge too much for it, but they feel this pressure. They're like, what can we do? And so sometimes I feel like we're all trapped in this system of our own design, where no one's really happy with it. You know what I mean? I think it's an instinct of your businessman or woman to want to sell a good product for a good price, not to gouge people. And I sometimes feel like we're all victims of it, honestly. I don't have that much sympathy because I make so much money, but I feel that that's a deeper issue. Jim?
This may sound like a pie in the sky idea,
Sure.
but I've never understood why the internet is not free.
Yeah,
Why
good
it
question.
is not, that it's a public utility that is owned by the public.
Mm-hmm.
It has been privatized by corporations.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't hear any voices. The net neutrality issue begins to bring that discussion into it. But we have two classes of people already.
Yep.
People who are poor, who cannot afford internet access.
Yeah,
That's
I agree.
and that's very much about economic reality. And people who can afford it.
Mm-hmm.
That already exists now without the net neutrality thing going into place. So I'd like your ideas, Tim, about the reality of bringing this up and taking a position that the internet belongs to the public and not to private corporations. And if that is possible, what does that mean?
Yeah, that's a great point. I will agree with, there's one thing I agree with. Even though I am very happy that net neutrality has gotten the popularity it is. I mean, it's really hard to get attention to telecom issues. You know, they're not visceral. They've become that way, but they're not. You know, people don't feel them the way they do, like you know, a grand jury or people being killed, or you know, or things, or not enough food or something. But net neutrality is nonetheless, in some ways, as I said, the tip of the iceberg on this issue as to how we have allowed private concentrated power to have so much of what should be sometimes public things. Internet is relatively cheap to provide. It's not easy, but it's relatively cheap. So maybe it should be a public utility. You know, there has been efforts, you know, the problem is that one of the challenges that sometimes cities, if cities want to do that, they have to invest. They can't just imagine it's going to happen for free. They do have to invest in it. You know, there's an effort right now to turn phone booths into Wi-Fi hot centers, which I think is not a terrible idea. But if you really want to reach people with something that's, you know, it's like garbage collection is not free. It should be public service, but it's not. You don't just say, okay, it's going to happen. And that's what I think has been a problem with some of the public projects. So they're just been like, oh, we'll have a private public partnership or something. We won't have to spend any tax money at all, and it's all going to happen. It takes a serious public dedication. Other countries, I think, have done a better job with this than we have, because we always assume we can have everything for free and not have to worry about it, or we let a company do it and then get enormous profits out of it. But I said again, once you've got it set up, you know, $5 a month is all it costs. And so some way it's crazy we let the companies walk away with that extra $60 a month, providing, is it good customer service they provide? I don't think that's it. So what is the, where is the, you know, what's going on there? There is a sharp question. Yeah, sure, thank you.
You mentioned other countries. Could you give a couple of examples of what other countries are doing?
Yeah, so I'm not the world's expert. I don't think, other countries all have their own pathologies. I don't, like in some ways America does some things well. But I think the Dutch, for example, have had good net neutrality rules and substantial public investment. Some city-states and countries in Asia, like Singapore, I think has invested heavily in the public infrastructure. So, Singapore is an interesting country in their public investments, the degree they've done this. Korea has invested pretty heavily in things like this. So there's a couple countries around the world that have invested more heavily than we have.
Are they public utilities, or are they private-public?
So usually part of it is public and then part of it is private. So I think in Singapore, for example, I believe the government built out the fiber, but then they have individual companies offering the stuff for sale, doing customer relations and stuff like that, because they don't think to go, you know, just like that. There's a few models, and it was not clear we're doing the best here.
Behind you.
But I will say we're also not the worst. There's some countries that have been, like China is, I mean, they invest a lot, but I don't approve of their censorship policies. You know, you want to talk about not net neutrality, they just like block all. If you want to see what not net neutrality really looks like, China is a frightening model because it's censorship. The carrier chooses, and they self-censor. It's not always the government. Sometimes the equivalent of the telecom, you know, the phone company is like, oh, this site looks like it might be controversial. We better block it before government gets on our back. Right? There's a lot of self-censorship in countries like China. I think it's really...
Who owns the pipe in China?
It's the public, government-owned government-owned companies that are sort of private. But that's a big, yeah. Yeah. Oh, sure. Well, him and then you.
I think it was first.
Yeah, sorry. Go ahead. Yeah.
So, like, I heard like representatives of like, you know, these telecommunications industries describe like non-net neutrality as if like a fast lane and a very fast lane, which seems funny because I don't even know Comcast offered a fast lane in the first place.
Yeah.
But in reality, like, would we see like accessibility like slow down to the point where like certain websites would be nearly inaccessible, or like?
I just think what would happen is all the sites that are not as commercial, like let's say Wikipedia,
Okay.
would be slower, just kind of lousier, not function as well. I think things like YouTube and Netflix would be fine, although they would start to get more expensive. So Netflix would have to go up, there'd have to be more advertising on Google, because what the cable and phone companies want to do is charge a lot, they want to set a new baseline. Already they collect enough money from all of customers. As I said, 97% margins. They'd also like another income stream from the internet companies, where they go around, they do this, they go around all the internet companies and be like, you know, I really think it's important. Your competitor has the fast lane. Maybe you should think about it too, and let's work out a deal. Like that is the ideal, because then they have two income streams. And then I'll point this out. Then their incentive always becomes, phone and cable companies at that point, for internet access never be that fast, because then if you don't have some scarcity, there's nothing to sell. Does everyone see this point? It's a little bit, it's a very subtle point. I think business models make a big difference. You know how on airplanes, airline industry also drives me crazy. Airlines have progressively made economy class less and less and less bearable because they want you to pay for this, pay for that, pay for this. And so we have a business model that where you sort of degrade your product slightly to pay people to upgrade. I'm worried that's what happens to the internet. It's kind of just like, oh, so you know, can you fork it out or not? I think also disproportionately smaller nonprofit speakers get hurt. So like Wikipedia, bloggers, you know, small newspapers, if you have a website, things like that. And people don't get hurt are the big commercial entities. Like, I mean, yes, I think that's how it goes. Yeah.
I'm just curious, what would happen to like government websites, do you think?
I think they would probably treat government websites fine, just in order to like stay friends with them. That's what I mean. You know, that's stay fine. You know, why antagonize the government? That's what I think. You had a question, sure.
Yeah, I've been hearing about certain places, like very rural places that can't get internet, and they've actually invested in free Wi-Fi.
Yeah.
You know about that, right?
Yeah, there's been a lot of, yeah. Do you want me to talk about it?
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a mixed record. I think this goes a little bit back to some of the questions. Is like, and I think there's a real American spirit, which is like, if our service, which I respect, which is to say, if the big company's not going to deliver, why don't we do it ourselves? You know, why not just organize something ourselves like Wi-Fi? Some of the free Wi-Fi projects have been successful. A lot of them have not been successful. Even though they sound really great, it's because, as I said before, it requires some investment. The municipality, whoever it is, you can't just wave a wand and say, okay, we have free Wi-Fi now. They have to, you know, even your local coffee shop has to invest if they want to have a good free Wi-Fi service. So there's some amount of investment that's required.
Did you talk to Seattle? What happened there?
I don't know the full, I know about a lot of, Philadelphia had a project like this, Toronto a lot of projects, and the technology wasn't always strong enough. The density of Wi-Fi you need in order to have this work is pretty intense, because Wi-Fi gets blocked by walls like this. Like these thick walls block it, so you have to actually get inside things. So it's a big public works project. And I think some of the efforts have just been, well, we can have a private contractor do it, be fine, or we don't have to worry, and it hasn't worked out as well as I might have hoped. You know, we kind of need a universal service of our time. I mean, remember I went back to the phone company and said, the deal was, okay, you get to be a monopolist. Those days they didn't mince any words. Today no one is a monopolist. Every market is competitive. I heard I was at a hearing today. Comcast representative said, you know, cable is an incredibly competitive industry. There's no more competitive industry now. Like, yes. I was like, there this stuff. And I was like, oh, yeah, everything is a competitive industry, right? I mean, so many people don't have any choice but that. But I mean, the old days, if you were a monopolist, it meant there were some public duties, like you had to wire everybody, you know, or even when you think about the old airline industry, they had to go to towns they might not want to go to because you need them, or the train, right? The train is run by government now, but you know, they would go to everywhere. That was sort of the deal. And today we have half the deal. You get to be a monopolist. The public duty part is gone. And even the sense of noblesse oblige, you know, almost like we should do this, we're making something, it's gone. It's like, so I think this is a serious problem in our time. I think, yeah, there's a lack of ethics even in the public spirit. He hasn't had a question yet.
Tim, I want to thank you for your leadership on this important issue.
Uh-huh.
And also, I think it's useful to look back at the example of the Roosevelts. We saw that documentary recently by Ken Burns. And you know, Teddy Roosevelt did go after the trust busters.
Yeah.
He broke up Standard Oil and broke up the big railroads and stuff. So and he also he launched off on his own candidacy for president in 1912. He started his own progressive party, which they called the Bull Moose. So I'm trying to connect the dots between that, between the increasing corporatization of our politics now, that you saw with Citizens United and that sort of thing, and also your insurgency with Zephyr Teachout, and thinking about going forward and how we put this all together and craft a language that a lot of these issues that seem disconnected are actually, there's a common theme here, that there's a increased corporatization. How can we
Right.
address that politically?
Well, I definitely think we're, by the way, I don't know who's, tell me when I'm out of time, by the way.
You
So
have about 10 minutes.
Okay, I just don't want to run into the vice presidential elections or whatever. There is a moment here. I think we're in a situation very much like 100 years ago. When Zephyr and I decided to run, one of the first things we did was read the platform of the 1912 Progressive Party, and we realized that compared to them, we looked like right-wing moderates. You know what I mean? They were like, and this is Theodore Roosevelt, this is a Republican, and they were like, we need to take on the trust. In fact, I remember a quote from the document. He says, "We have a problem in this country of an invisible government. The government we see is not actually in charge. It is their masters behind them, and we must smash this invisible government and get to what's behind it." And I was like, what do we do? We're playing around with these little things, What was left in those days was Louis Brandeis and Theodore. I mean, they would be considered off the charts communists in today's thing. Louis Brandeis and Theodore Roosevelt, some of the most respected leaders in the United States history, or even Andrew Jackson, who said that the death of this country will be this corporate form which has no humanity. It's going to take over. These are not
Dwight Eisenhower.
these are not radical. Yeah, the military-industrial complex. Yeah. So these are not radical figures, and I think there was a time where people pick up and say this is too much. I think we're in that era now. I think you see it drawing from a lot of areas, whether it's the Occupy movement leading to some of the protests this weekend. I think are going to show some of this energy, some of the excitement around net neutrality. I just think what has to come to the fore are candidates who are willing to speak on these economic justice issues and not just sort of say a little bit but then leave it, kind of say, inequality is a problem, but imagine that somehow if we don't actually tackle the industries, the problem will go away. And I think it's recognizing you're part of a movement. I think it's running for office. I mean, one of the reasons I ran is because I thought, these ideas are here and now, and we got it, partially because Zephyr asked me, and the Teachout, and Zephyr is very persuasive. So that's what I think it is. I think it is partially recognizing you're in a moment, recognizing and having no shame about this problem. I mean, something that's not a problem at one period can become a problem later. So maybe like maybe it was bad, but maybe corporate concentration wasn't so bad, let's say, in some other era, maybe in the 60s or something. Actually, let's read that. But it was not as bad. But something can get worse because you just allow a merger policy. Things go too far. The pendulum swings, and then it's time to take action. That's where I think we are right now. Yeah, thank you very much. All right, that's an ode to end on. Thank you. Thank you so much. Pleasure. Real pleasure. I hope you're not offended. I need to get my wife and baby are waiting for me, so I may not say anything.
No, thank you so much. Thank you. It was terrific, really. I'm going to shamelessly pat it over the club. I'm running for office. I realize just how important it is to have civil society, have at least some people paying attention to politics. And you know this because you do pay attention, is just how influential small groups like this can be. I mean, when we got this endorsement, it gave us a shot in the arm, Zephyr and I. We're like, now we can go and do something. We're starting to get, we have like 2 clubs or something, but 2 is better than 0. And we felt, and so, this is sort of a tribute to the way that the country is supposed to be, and I'm honored to be here again. Thank you very much.